Hi everyone, I'm Gergana, but that's quite hard to pronounce, so please feel free to call me Jerry. And I work here at BBD. We're a software consulting firm, and I work in the R&D department at BBD. What does the R&D department do? That's not very easy to define. We do a lot of things. We do research, obviously, of being the R&D department. We do some training of the BBD developers, and we also do some specialized consulting. But BBD as a whole works in creating custom software for telecoms, banking, insurance. We are, I think, the biggest custom software development company in South Africa, and we have about 500 or 600 developers working for us. But we don't have a lot of female developers working for us, and that's why we decided to get involved with Girl Code. All of the ladies you see wearing these t-shirts also work with me at BBD, and they're going to be helping you today when you get stuck. So what we're going to do today is learn about HTML and CSS. Now, someone saw this up on the screen and was worried that you had to do some pre-reading or something like that. Don't worry about that. That's mainly to remind me what I'm supposed to be telling you. So we'll start with HTML. We'll spend about 1 hour on learning HTML. And it will be mostly theory, so just try to pay attention. I'm going to be showing you, some code. Okay, can't stand there. I'm going to be showing you some HTML code, how it's structured, how it's used. Then we're going to take a short break, and we're going to go into CSS. We're going to spend about 1 hour on CSS. How is CSS used, what it is. And then after that, you get to do the practical part. But we'll get there a little bit later. So let's get started. Just a quick show of hands. How many people here have done web development before? Okay, we have a few. All right, don't worry about it. So I'm a web developer. I really love web development. And now I'm going to ask you a quick question, and I'm going to judge you based on your answer. Who of you think that web development is easy? You can be honest. I'm not that scary, I promise. Well, only one person. Okay, well, that's a start. Web development is not easy. Web development is not about making things pretty. It's got a lot more to do with actually working on real-world applications. Because think about it. How long has the web been around? Anyone? Since the first web server was built in 1991. That means it's older than some of you sitting in this room. Okay. So the web has been around for a long time, and it will be around for a very long time still to come. And it's not a fad. It's not something like Android or iOS, which is going to potentially die in a couple of years' time. It will stay. How often do you go to a website? Every day. How many of you have been to Facebook and Twitter just this morning? Yeah, exactly, 5 minutes ago. So that's why it's important to know how the web works. And HTML and CSS are the basic building blocks of the web. It's what you use to create web pages. I'm going to have to move a bit. Excuse me. Otherwise, that's going to keep happening. I think that's fine. All right. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's not technically a programming language. It's a markup language. So it's used for your browser to know what to put on the screen. HTML can be very complicated and it can be very simple as well. And it makes the document or the text or anything like that that you're trying to display, it makes it go onto your browser screen. HTML is made up of elements. So an element is something like that p tag over there. That's an HTML element. Now, HTML elements are case insensitive, so you can write them however you want to. You can write capital P, you can write small p, you can write title with capital T, small I, and capital T, and so on. But some people just want to watch the world burn, that's why they do that. So best practice is to just write it in lowercase letters. That's not compulsory, you don't have to do that, but it's just best practices. So this is what an HTML element looks like. So that whole thing is an HTML element. The P opening tag and closing tag, the only difference is that there's a slash in front of the NP. That says this is where this paragraph ends. And then inside it is the content. An HTML document looks like this. So because the web has been around, and you zoom in a bit there. Can you guys at the back see that? Cool. All right. So because HTML has been around for such a long time, that's where this thing at the top here comes. HTML is an XML-based language. So this over here says that this XML document is an HTML document. And back in the day, before HTML5 came about, you used to have to specify things like what your encoding was and what you would be using to display this in this over here. But now all you have to do is to keep up with the current standards, you have to just put that in the front. Then the next important part is the HTML tag. So this is specifying that this is where our HTML document starts. And then at the bottom, we close the HTML tag, so this is where it ends. Then we have a header tag. In the header tag, we can specify things like metadata tags. The metadata tags just provide information about your page. They won't ever get displayed or anything like that. They're just giving more information about the page. So other metadata tags examples are things like authors and encodings, languages, things like that. Then the title should not be confused with the header. The title is the thing that gets displayed in the little bar over here. So let's just open this. Google Chrome. So the title is up here, this over there. That is the stuff that goes in the header page. Other things that go inside the header tags are things like links to CSS, which we'll do a little bit later, links to JavaScript scripts, which we're doing next week, for those of you coming next week, and links to icons or other assets. All of those things go inside your header tag. Then there's the body, and this is the part of the page that's visible to everyone. This is the part of the page that gets displayed over here. And the part of the page where you add all of your other elements and text and pictures and everything like that all goes in here and gets displayed over here. Excuse me. So when you start with a basic HTML page, this is what you would start with. Okay, maybe without this part here. Another thing that's important in HTML is that white space doesn't matter. So what that means is if we have this, and we have this, how do you think those two things will get displayed on our page? Exactly the same. Let's have a look. See, white space doesn't matter. So you have special elements and tags which you need to use in order to create more white space. So in order to create a new line, you have to use a BR. You can also create a horizontal rule, so a new line with a line which is a HR. And to create white space, you use this special character in the SP. That's the one. So that means white space. So if we have a look at this now, it would look quite different. Like with every other programming language, you have to be able to comment things out. To comment things out in HTML, you use these tags over here. So it's one of the very weird ones. So most other languages use like some sort of combination of slash and star. So that's why you do it this way. So with an exclamation mark at the front and no exclamation mark at the back. All right, then you see on my PDF that I'll give you afterwards. If you'd like, I can copy it onto a flash drive for you. I'll have references to the Mozilla developer site. If you want to learn things about the web, this is one of the best places to start. They have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, everything to do with web development. So the Mozilla developers. All right. So let's move to part 2 of HTML. So the main purpose of HTML is to display text. So one of the things we're going to concentrate the most on in this section is how to display text on the screen, different ways of displaying text. So most structured text has headings, paragraphs, asides, tables, lists, and so on. So there's a newspaper, structured text. So we need to be able to structure our HTML as well. Two of the most common tags used in HTML are the paragraph tag, which we saw being used here, and the div tag. The div tag is a very common non-semantic tag that says this is a section. It doesn't say what kind of section it is. It doesn't say anything else about the section. It just says it's a piece of code. Or text, not code. Then the next important one is headers. Headers always start with an H, and then they go from 1 up to 6. 1 is the biggest header, and 6 is the smallest one. So if you have my header here, then you would have H2 as your subheader, and then H3 as the next one. Best practices for headers, don't skip headers. So don't go from 1 to 3 to 7. Oh, no, there's no 7. Sorry. I was testing you there. All right, so you should try and keep it numbered correctly. Then after headers, we have tables. I'm just going to copy the table I have in my example. For those of you who have installed Visual Studio Code and you're going to be using it, one of the most useful shortcuts for Visual Studio Code, Alt-Shift-F. It formats your code and makes it look pretty. Not related to HTML, it can format any code, just so. So you know, when you see my code jump into place, that's what I'm doing. Yep. Alt-Shift-F. Okay, so what kind of data do we display in a table? Who can tell me? Comparisons, yeah. Just general tabular data. Lists of stuff, yes. So that is one very important thing. So a lot of you probably wouldn't have been around when people used to use tables to structure their web page. Now, this is bad practice. You don't use tables to make a 3-column layout on your web page. That used to be done before. You don't do that anymore, all right? So, because it's quite easy to now use other CSS and proper grid layouts to do that, we don't use tables. And one of the other reasons not to use tables is because tables aren't responsive. So when you open that web page on your phone, it would look terrible because it will still be very wide and you'd have to scroll sideways. So tables are for tabular data. Never use them to structure your page. A table tag is called table, and it can have a few different things. So it can have a caption so that you have a little title for your table. It can have the T-head and T-body and T-foot inside a table. So what that does is, even though this T-foot is over here, it will get displayed at the bottom. They need to zoom in a bit more. I see a few people squinting. Okay. I can give you this PDF. You don't have to take photos. It will make your life easier. Cool. So the T-head, T-foot, and T-body are not necessary. You don't have to put them there. But what they will do is this T-foot, even though it's above the body, it will still display at the bottom because it knows it's a footer. Then inside we have TH for TR, sorry, for table row. So that creates one row in the table. And then TH is for table header. So browsers know that a table header needs to be displayed differently to a normal table column. A table header will usually be displayed in bold or something like that. Then the actual body has TD. Now, I still haven't actually found out what TD stands for, but it's a column. I don't know why they didn't call it TC. And if we have a look what our table looks like, you can see the footer has been put at the bottom. So when should you not use HTML tables? We spoke about this already. And then lists. So table data is for displaying lists of things that have multiple properties, while lists are for displaying simple lists. So you can have an ordered list and an unordered list. An ordered list, you use OL, and each list item is LI, list item. And then you can say list item 1. And 2. And that displays it 1, 2. Important things on the ordered list is you can also specify a type for it, which I didn't put here. But so that you don't necessarily, if you don't want it to be 1, 2, 3, if you want it to be ABC, then what you would do is say type equals A. Ooh. And then it goes AB. And you can use 1, 2, 3 ABC as well as Roman numerals. So you can put an I there and it will go I. And again, with the letters, you can go caps and small. Then an unordered list is done exactly the same way, except we use UL. So an unordered list just has bullet points instead of ABCs or 1, 2, 3s. Then this thing that I did over here, this here, this is called an attribute. This is an attribute of an HTML element. Attributes are used to define the elements. And these attributes are nice for when you want to style your elements. So 2 very important attributes that we're going to come across later on when we do the CSS stuff is the ID attribute and the class attribute. Right. The ID attribute is the identifier of this HTML element, which means that this element's name or unique identifier is test. We can't have another element inside this document that has that same ID. IDs have to be unique. Now, your web page won't actually break, but it won't work correctly. It will warn you about it. That's one thing with HTML and CSS, is often stuff doesn't break, it just looks weird. And then you don't know what you've done wrong. So you might be missing a closing tag somewhere, or you might have duplicate IDs and you won't be able to figure out what's happening. But that's the web. Then classes are what we're going to be using in the CSS section to style our elements. Classes, you can specify multiple classes in here. So, and these classes all apply to that element. And these classes can be used on multiple elements. So you can have the same style for multiple list elements on your page. All of these are attributes. You'll see some other attributes we're going to use a little bit later. Important thing to note about attributes is that you don't have to specify, you don't have to put inverted commas around them. You can put single or double, or you don't have to put them. But what becomes a problem is when you have spaces like in the class one. If you didn't have these around here, then it would get confused and not know that this is both for your class. So, best practice, double quotes. The reason it's double quotes rather than single quotes is because every now and then you might have an apostrophe in the text that you've written inside your attribute, and then it gets confused as to which one it's actually using. So rather use double quotes. And then you also get some Boolean attributes. So An input is something that expects the user to put something into the form, right? Input. And it has types. If you don't specify the type on an input, it would be text, so it will be a text box. But you can specify it. So an input box gets displayed like this, and I can click on it and type in it. But one thing that's different with this input box compared to these other elements that we've been looking at is that it's an empty element. So it doesn't have a closing tag like the lists and paragraphs. It only closes just like this. What that means is that this element can't have text inside it. So you can't do things like what we did with the paragraph, where we said, this is a paragraph. You can't do that inside an input element. That would break your web page. But what a Boolean attribute is an attribute that takes in either a true or false value. So an input can be disabled. Now, this is equivalent to this is equivalent to this. This is a Boolean attribute. So all three of these text boxes, wrong button, will be disabled. So now I can't click inside them and I can't type anything in them. Omitting quotes, single, double, we talked about that. One of the biggest things about the web is being able to connect to other parts of the web, because if it was just one big web page that had everything on it, no one would actually use it, right? And for that, we have hyperlinks. A hyperlink can link to a page, another page within your project, or it can link to something else external, so another website, or it can link to an image, or it can link to a download. And we use A. A stands for anchor, and the compulsory property of an anchor tag is the href. Href is the reference or the page you're going to be navigating to. So http www, too many W's, google.com. And then the text you put inside the anchor is what gets displayed. Go to Google. Now if we click the link, it will redirect us to Google. Links can have absolute URLs like this, where you specify the full URL of exactly where you want to go. Or it can be a relative URL, so relative to the current page that I'm in. So if I had in my project another page, page2.html, and let's just copy that into page 2. I could link this, because it's in the same folder, I could just go page2.html, and that would redirect me to that other page. And using the relative URL, you can filter down into your directory structure, however far you need to go to find the page you want to go to. Using relative URLs is usually good when you're using it within your own web page. You shouldn't put fully qualified URLs in your own web pages, because it means that when you deploy it to different servers, so when you're running it locally, it has the file or wherever your file is stored. But when you deploy it somewhere to a website, you have some different URL in front. So it's good to use relative URLs for that purpose. Only when you're linking to something external do you specify the full URL. Then some other useful properties on anchors is the target. Target blank. Was it like that? I'm going off script here, sorry. Yes, okay, it was. So what that does is it opens in a new blank window. So target blank opens in a new window rather than the same one in your browser. Then you can also have a title. A title is an attribute that you can have on almost all HTML elements. And what the title is when you hover over it, it gets displayed. So if we go here again and refresh, you can see very tiny over there the title that I wrote in. Now, one thing to note about links is there's certain best practices around links. You have to be careful when creating links. So you can put a link anywhere because it's an inline element. So we could do something like this. Go to this website. And when you display it here, keep hitting the wrong button, sorry. You can see it gets displayed in one line, but only this is the link. The rest is just normal text. Now that's great. For you and me, that's very easy to understand what that means. But there's certain people who are visually impaired, for example, and when they're using a screen reader to read this, they don't actually know which part of that link is clickable. So when you specify the text inside your link, you need to make sure that what it says is clear, that this is the link you need to click on. And also, don't just put it in the title, because the title doesn't get displayed in a screen reader. Only this text gets displayed. So when naming your links, or when putting text inside your links, you have to be quite careful and be considerate of other people. Don't say things like link or links, or this is a link, or click here. That's bad practices. Keeping your labels as short as possible, that's also very good. And minimize instances where multiple copies of the same text are linked to different places. So when you use click here to link to one place and click here to link to a different place, don't do that. Using relative links, we spoke about that. When you're linking to non-HTML resources, so say you have a big PDF you want someone to download with all of your, I don't know, photos from something, and it's 100 megs big. You need to specify clearly that it is a big PDF and it's going to download something. So you would say, my photos, and in brackets, PDF 20 megabytes. That way, when we're using our crappy Vodacom internet, which charges us 2 rand a megabyte, we will know not to click that link. One part I see I've actually missed here in my notes is forms. So how often do we fill in forms on a web page, right? Quite often. So in HTML, we have a form tag. The form tag has a special attribute called an action. This action is what you would link in your form tag to, whether it be some sort of thing that you're calling on a backend server somewhere, or if it's another web page it needs to go to save the data you filled into the form. So that's what your action is, what you're going to do when we're done with this form. Then form elements, we have inputs, like we spoke about the text input. We also have selects, which are drop downs. And a select takes in options. With a value, this is the value that will actually get saved when you pick that thing. So 1 and the text like that. Ooh. That's a select box. Then once you've finished completing a form, you need to submit that form. So we need a button. There are two ways of creating a button. One, by using the input and specifying a type of submit. What this input button will do is it will call whatever action you've specified over here. You also have an input of type button. This type of input needs to be told what it's going to happen when it gets clicked. So you would have a click here, which says do this when we click this button. Then there's also a button. One important thing about this input is it needs to have a value. Button 1. Value submit 1. The difference semantically, or how the browser treats these two over here, is exactly this. There's no difference. It gets treated exactly the same. So it's the same, it's two different ways of doing the exact same thing. The reason they have both of them, the button one, is so that you can put other things inside here. Because inside this value, because this is an empty element, you can only put text. So the value of the name of your button can only be text. While this one is not an empty element. So I could put an image for my button. I could put anything I like for my button. So that's the difference between these two. Right. And then, long ago, the web was very boring. It only used to have text. And then they were like, but that's boring. We want something to make it prettier. And that's when they created the image tag. So the image tag is specified with img. and it has one compulsory attribute, which is the source attribute. The source attribute specifies where to get that image from. So I don't have an image. Let's get an image. Images. Sorry, I did have an image. I don't know where it went. Put it here. So the image can be any format. It can be a PNG, a JPEG, a SVG, any image format. And in the source, we specify where to find it. Like the links, the source can be an absolute URL or a relative URL. Now, you do have to be careful when using absolute URLs for your images. Firstly, because you need to make sure that you are allowed to use someone else's images on your page. And secondly, because they might move and then your page has a broken link. But this is the simplest way to display an image. Or not. What's happening? It's display. Oh, it's really big. That's what's happening. Need to zoom out. It is there. Didn't break it. Here we go. Our image is displaying. So because it's so big, let's make it a little bit smaller. On an image, you can specify the width and height directly. If you specify just a width, it will change the height related to that width. So it will keep the image in the same proportions. Same with the height. If you specify both the width and the height, it would skew your image and make it look funny. You specify the width and height in numbers, and it usually uses pixels to size it. Now, this is one way to size an image or to size something on a web page, but the better way to do it is using CSS, which we're going to cover a little bit later. Other important things about images. So a lot of the rules we spoke about with links also apply to images, because a visually impaired person cannot see the image. So you need to describe to them what that image is. And for that, you get the alt attribute. Alt is the text that will get displayed if your image is broken. So in my alt attribute, where I have the BBD logo, I would say this is the BBD logo. Now, normally, nothing happens. But if my image link was broken, so say I misspelled something, it will show me a broken image link and the alt text that I specified. Now, the broken image link is a Chrome thing, so different browsers might display this part differently. So if you don't see the broken image link, don't worry. So the alt attribute is dependent on what you're actually trying to display with that image. So if it is just a logo, like our logo over here, we could have just said BBD logo. That's enough, because it would probably be in the top corner somewhere, and as you're reading the website, it would be like, oh, that's where the logo goes. Okay, that makes sense. If it's content, then firstly, you need to think about whether you should be using an image, because if it's a table that you have as a picture, shouldn't you rather put that in a table? Like rewrite all of that information into a table. So that's the first thing you need to consider when it's content. And then the alt text can describe the content as best as possible if you have to use the image. If it's a link inside the image, so you still need to provide accessible link text. So you need to say that this image is actually a link. Don't just put the image in there, put some text in as well. And then again with text, you should consider whether you should be typing out that text rather than displaying it in an image. Then also, for a very long time, even after we had images on the web, we didn't have video and audio. It was really difficult to put a video onto your web page. You had to use things like iframes and embed them using YouTube or whatever was around at that time. But then with HTML5, we got video and audio tags. Now, a video tag looks like this. It's still inside the form. Again, you have to specify the source for the video tag, and then we have the Boolean attribute called controls. This means add the controls at the bottom that will display like the play and pause and all that stuff. What's nice about the video tags is there are still browsers which do not support playing video directly, and you can just add this paragraph tag over here, and if the browser doesn't support it, it will display this instead of displaying the video tag. Then different browsers support different video types. So this WebM one is one that's supported by Chrome and I believe Firefox as well. But because of the different standardization for encoding of video, browsers find it quite hard to keep up, so they don't always support the same kinds of things. So you can supply different sources. But then what you do is you leave the source blank there, and you supply the sources like this. Hold on. Just want to make sure I'm getting this right. So here you can see we've now supplied two, MP4 and WebM. So what it would do is when you open your browser, it will go to the first one and see, oh no, I can't play this one. I'm going to go to the second one. And if it can't play the second one, then it will display that paragraph. So you should always try to supply, if you are adding a video to your web page, try to supply as many of the different sources as you can, so that it gets makes it easier for people to actually see your video. Then the controls display the little thing with the bottom where you can play and pause the video, and there's a whole bunch of other attributes you can add. So things like width and height, like with the image we can specify the width and the height of the video. You can do things like autoplay. Don't do that. Who hates it when you go to a website and it immediately starts playing music and you don't know where it's coming from? Yeah, so don't do that. Don't be that guy. Loop, muted, all of these are extra things you can specify in your video. And with the audio element, it's pretty much exactly the same. So it looks very similar. And again, you can specify different formats, so for the different browsers to support. And you can specify if your browser can't play it, You can specify the controls, the loop, the autoplay, all of those things. The only thing you can't specify on an audio is the width and the height, because it doesn't really have a width and a height. So it doesn't have the visual part. One other thing that I missed on the video, which is quite cool, is you can also specify a poster. So you can have an image for your video that is the specific main image when the video is not playing that gets displayed, which is also quite nice. And this is what the audio player looks like in your browser, over there. And this is what the video one looks like. And that's HTML in a very, very small nutshell. What is CSS? How many people here have written CSS before? No. Not many. Okay, that's good. So, yeah, CSS, even if you've written a little CSS, you know something. Now, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's what we use to cascading style sheets. Yes. And it's what we use to make our web pages look pretty. It's how we style them. And we do things like adding colors, moving things on the pages. That's why we don't use tables anymore, because we have the power of CSS. Now, CSS has been around for a very long time, at least 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. And over the years, it has grown more and more, because more things keep being added onto it, because the web has more and more requirements. And therefore, CSS can get to a point where it's really, really complicated. But it's because of that, because it's been changing and growing so much over the years, yet all of the stuff that was put in there when it was first created can't be removed, because web pages are still using it. And one of the single most important rules about the web is you can change the web, you can grow the web, you can do whatever you want to the web, but don't break the web. Okay. All right. So CSS is also a programming language, and it specifies the styles, the layout, and it's applied directly to your HTML. Now, there are 3 ways to apply CSS to your HTML. The first way to apply CSS to your HTML, and the incorrect way to apply CSS to your HTML, is inline. So, this is a paragraph, and then you can go style, color, and you have to spell it the American way, blue. So this is inline styles. As good web developers, we don't do this. Don't ever do this. Bad. Why don't we do this? Because it's very difficult to manage. It's very difficult to change. If you've put this on every single paragraph tag in your HTML in a big website, imagine if someone comes to you and says, oh no, I don't want it to be blue anymore, it must be red. Find replace, I guess. All right, so this is bad. We don't do it like this. One other way we can do it, and it's not that bad, but you can specify it at the top of each of your pages, like this. And then in here, we could say that P must be color blue. This style here, if it's specified in your web page, will only apply inside this page. So if you have a paragraph tag in another HTML page, it won't apply there. So this is a little bit less specific than inline because it will apply to all paragraph tags within this page, but a little bit more manageable. So say you only have a specific style that is only for this HTML page, then you would do this. The best way to specify styles is actually separate to your HTML, because at the end of the day, your styles, how your page looks and how your page is structured, are two separate things. So the correct way to specify your styles is to link them in another page. So we're going to create a page over here called styles.css. .css for cascading style sheets. And now inside here, we can, I'm just going to close these for now. Go again, P, color blue. And now we need to tell our HTML page where our CSS page is. So to do that, in our head tag, we go link. Hold on, I don't want to mess this up. What type of link we're providing. So the REL, which I'm not really sure what it stands for, but it's what type of link we're providing. So it's a style sheet. href is for style CSS files. All right, cool. So you can have one global style sheet. So usually it's good to have one global style sheet that applies to all of your pages. So certain things like the main colors of your website you would keep there, for example, or the main background that's on every page, things like that, that you would keep there. And you can link multiple style sheets. And then the more specific you get, the more you would have just one style sheet per page. But it's usually better to write as little styles as possible. So you should try to keep your styling very concise, so very well defined, so that you don't get to a point where some very specific style is overwriting some other style, because then it becomes very difficult to figure out why this is displaying red when on this style sheet it says it should be blue. So, and that's actually what brings me to the reason it's called cascading style sheets, because it works in a cascading way in terms of the styles that get applied to it. So it depends on three things which style is going to get applied. Really? So first one is importance, then it's specificity, that's a hard word to say, and then it's source order. Okay, so importance is something, let's copy this and explain it. It's easier to explain when you have code to look at. I'm just going to zoom out once. So we have two paragraphs here, and they both have classes. This one has an ID. We're going to talk about how we select each of these. Oh, no formatting for CSS. Got to format it myself. So Visual Studio Code doesn't have formatting for all languages, but you can install other ones. Okay. But our style sheet is now applied. So we have over here a few styles. This style over here is being applied to the ID called winning. ID winning. The hashtag says applied it to the ID attribute. Okay? And it's setting the color, the background color to red and the border to 1 pixel solid black. Then the class called beta, which is applied to both of these paragraph tags, has a background color of gray and a border of none. And then the paragraph tag has a background color of blue, the text color of white, and a padding of 5 pixels. However, the beta class has an exclamation mark important. This means that no matter where this style appears, it's the most important style, so apply this one. So even though the winning tag at the top here is more specific, it's saying that it must be applied to the ID and it must be 1 pixel solid and black, it won't apply because of this important tag. So the important tag is like the one who rules them all, so it will apply to everything. The important tag can be useful, but it can also be very dangerous. So it's usually not good to use the important tag because you might be overriding something else that you shouldn't be. So it's better to figure out why a style isn't being applied rather than just putting important on it to make it. So that's the first one. Then the second one is, the second way that things get applied is specificity. So that pretty much is how specific something is. So with the paragraph that we have over here, the P tag, this style gets applied to all P tags in the page, while the class style gets applied to all tags that have that class. So that probably means it's going to be less tags because not everything will have that class. And then the ID style, remember what we said about IDs? IDs can only be put on one element. It means that this style over here will only ever apply to one element. And that's what the specificity means. So the less amount of things that a style can apply to, the more chances of it being applied. Does that make sense? So that's why when we look at these two paragraphs over here, this one is red, because the background color of the ID tag, which is only one element, is red, while beta, which is the class, is applied to two tags. That's why the red wins. Okay. Same thing is as if we removed this over here, the important, and we refreshed. Then this would get its border. Again, ID wins because it applies to only one. Class applies to two. That's why it loses. And then the last thing in terms of style sheet, of cascading style sheets and how they would get applied to your HTML, is also the reason they're called cascading style sheets. So they work from the top downwards. So the last style you wrote is the style that gets applied. If it's the exact same thing, if we have a P which is a color blue and a P which is a color red, whichever one comes second is the one that will get this displayed. So there's a few different types of selectors. The first one we spoke about was the P tag. So a tag like this means find every paragraph element in our page and apply this style to it. So that you can do for a paragraph, a div, an anchor, an image. That's one of the simple tags. Then we have the class. The class starts with a dot. So any classes you define over here, in your class attribute on your HTML, you would be able to access them in your styles with a dot in front. So, and then the last one over here is the hash. The hash is to say for an ID, this is an ID that I'm looking for in my HTML. There's one more selector known as the universal selector. The universal selector is a star. The universal selector means select absolutely everything and apply this style to it. The universal selector is not often used because, as you can imagine, because it's very non-specific, it will usually get overwritten eventually by some other style somewhere further down the line. So that means that very often, unless it's something like you want to keep the font the same throughout your entire website, that's somewhere where you would use the universal selector. But other than that, it will probably get overwritten by a more specific style on a paragraph or a class or an ID or something like that. Class selectors, ID selectors, universal. Okay. Then we can also get attribute selectors. So sometimes you might have very specific attributes on your elements, things that just define your elements. So, for example, I can say data dash my attribute and say that this is item 1. This won't affect my HTML at all. You won't even see it at all in your HTML page. But now I can do things like in my CSS where I filter by an attribute. And we do that with square brackets. So by saying P square brackets data dash my attribute color blue. That means take all P tags and look for the ones that have that attribute defined on them and apply this style to that. So these kinds of attributes you would use for styling things very specifically. But you don't have to just look for an attribute. You can also search by the value that is assigned to that attribute by having an equals or having a starts with this string, and then you can be very, very specific about what you're applying this class to. So if we have a link anchor tag with href to, what was it, page 2. This is a link. There's certain styles that get applied onto your HTML by the browser itself. So you can see my link over here is purple because I've clicked on it before. So a visited link would be purple. How can I check that? See that over there, colon hover. If I click on that, it gives me all of the possible states my link can be in. So let's just select the link. And I can apply that. And if in my styles I have a hover, which means For all anchor tags, when you hover over them, then change the background color to purple. Then, firstly, if I hover over my link, it changes to purple. But then, if I want to test my style, I can apply that over here and see it change. And then it appears over here as well. So you can change it and see if you want to be changing that to something else. And that's called pseudo classes. So here's a long list of all of the pseudo classes you can use. But some of the most common ones and the ones I've used most often are hover, active, which is if a link is currently being clicked, so as you click it, it can change color. Visited, which is what the browser uses to display the links in purple when you've clicked on them before. And then you get ones that are like valid and invalid. Those are quite useful for when you're creating forms. And then you can use those to style your text boxes differently based on whether the input inside them is valid or not. And there's a whole lot of them. Another useful one is first. So if you have a list of items and you say only the first one needs to be styled a certain way, you can use first. First child as well, which is, so in an element, the first child element of a parent element. And then you also get things like nth child, so you can specify which number. Okay, then we have pseudo elements. Now, pseudo elements are used mainly to, again, style and also insert extra things. So one of the useful ones with pseudo elements is styling the first letter of something. So you can say, A or 2 colons first letter, and then you can make the first letter a different color. So this is useful if you want to capitalize the first letter of every sentence, for example. You wouldn't probably make the first letter red, but. And then the before and after. The before and after can be used to insert content into it. So if we say A after content, and we refresh this, you can see the hello gets added onto the end. This is what gets used quite a lot to display icons. So when you put in some text and you want to display an icon at the back that's not standard text, you would use a before or after tag to put that. And then, because using one selector at a time is useful, but sometimes you need to apply multiple styles to multiple things, you get combinators. So you can combine all of your selectors so that you can apply a certain style to multiple things. The first combinator is the comma. So if we go back here and we say that A and P should all be blue. We save that. So it means all anchors, all paragraphs must be blue. That's the comma. Then we have the space. The space one is a descendant selector. So P space A
means that it would look for anchor tags inside the paragraph tag. So in our case, now, it would be none of them. But if we take this anchor tag and put it inside here, like that, it will be blue. Okay, so that's the space. So any anchor tag within a p tag becomes blue. Then we have the greater than, which is direct child. Then we also have the plus, which is for siblings. So apply this to this element and the one on the same level as it. So in our case, this paragraph and this span are on the same level. So apply it to all paragraphs and spans that are on the same level. And the tilde is a general sibling. So it doesn't have to be the next sibling, the one right next to it. It can be one further down in your document, but it's still on the same level. Okay, so now we've seen a few of these over here, but let's speak about more of them. In terms of typography, you can change quite a few different things with your CSS. The first one that we've seen a few times now is the color. Color, spelled the American way, would change the color of your text. And for this color attribute, you can specify a whole range of different, you can specify your colors in a whole range of different ways. So you have the way I've been doing it so far, named colors. So you can have, there's 140 named colors inside CSS that you can use. So what's nice with Visual Studio Code is when you go Control Space, it shows you the named colors. So you can use some of those, yeah? Yeah, so this is the named way, right? Then the other very much more common way is the hash value. So hash, and then it's 6 numbers or letters, or it's all in hexadecimal. So it's the numbers from 1 to 9 and the letters from A to F. And FF, FF, FF is white. 6 Fs. Okay, and is black. That's just so those two are the common ones, and then everything else in between as you change these colors changes. Okay, so that's another way you can specify your colors. This used to work. Okay. There used to be a really cool thing in Visual Studio Code. I think it's an extension that you have to install, and I haven't installed it. But where it allows you to click on this little block, and it gives you a little color picker, and it puts the hash value for you. Then other ways you can specify colors is by using RGB. So RGB stands for red, green, blue. And the way it works is you specify a value between 0 and 255 for red, green, and blue. So if you specify 255 in the red column, 0, 0, that would be red. And as you change those numbers, the colors change. Then there's also RGBA, where the A is the alpha channel, so it defines the opacity of the color. So you can make it look a little bit blurry. And it's a number between 0 and 1. So RGBA, and then you would specify it in here, 0.1, like that. You can also specify it with HSL and HSLA. In my quite a few years of experience in web development, I have never ever had to use this. So don't worry about that, knowing that one. The next thing you can do with your text is specify the font family. The font family is like in Word. We've all used Word where we can specify that we want to use Comic Sans. Don't do that. Okay. And fonts, usually you specify a few fonts because not all browsers or not all people always have all of the fonts you want to use installed on their computers. And that's why you specify a fallback font almost. So it will always try to use the first one and then move on to the second one, third one, fourth one. So the sans serif is the default one that gets displayed by default if you don't specify one, and that's the one that all browsers do have. And your font names don't sometimes have spaces in them, like these ones. So when they have spaces, you just put inverted commas around them. You can also specify your own fonts. So you can download fonts from online. Please only download them from free websites. Don't get anyone's copyrighted fonts. And then you can use the @fontface tag to say, this is my font and this is the file where you can find it. And then you can name it whatever you like. Then there's font size. Font size is the size of your text. There's no colon there. All of your styles should always end in a colon, otherwise it freaks out. So it doesn't know when the next style, the next property of the style is starting. Font size can be in pixels, it can be in percentages, it can be a few keywords like medium or small. Those are usually not great to use because that's the browser decides what medium is. So you can't really control that. So we have pixels, which is the number of pixels it will take up on the actual screen. We have EMs, which it's a value relative to whatever the parent is. So it cascades down into your other. So if you set your value of your H1 to some constant value, then H2 would be EM something, which means it will be relative to whatever H1 was. REM is also relative, but it's relative to the root element, so it's relative to the entire web page. Then we have percentages, which are usually quite good to use because that makes the pages very responsive. So I want this text to take up this % of the space I have available. If you put it to 100%, it will always be 100%. And then we have the other keywords like smaller and larger. So if we set it to 25 pixels, you can see it's a little bit bigger. Then we have font styles. So font styles are for making your words italic or emphasized, something like that. Font dash style. And for these, we have a few different values. These are the only values we can use. So it can be normal, which it is by default, it's normal. We can have italic, which will make the words a little bit slanted. And we can have oblique, which I can't say I've ever used before. More slanted than italic. Okay, didn't know that. Does it look that much more slanted to you? Anyway, but it's there. And then the other values you can use in here are things like inherit, meaning that inherit from your parent. But with most of the properties in CSS, you can usually make it inherit from the parent. So that is just by saying inherit. And initial is whatever its initial state was. Leave it at that. Don't ever change it. That's the style. And then we have the font property. So the font property is quite cool, but I always forget how to use it because you have to specify. So it's a shorthand for specifying all of these things in one go. So you go font, and then you say the size, what order is it in? Style, weight, size, line height, font family. But you have to put them in the correct order, and you are allowed to leave some of them out, but not all of them. So I usually just specify them one by one because I can never remember what the order is. But it's there. We also have text align. Text align is quite cool. So within a div, we can have text align center. And that would center align our text. Or you can have left, right, or justified text. Text decoration, so you can have things like underline, you can have a line crossing over your text, you can have something that's been there since the early 90s that they haven't removed yet, which is making your text blink. Because we want to give people epilepsy. So that's text decoration. Text overflow is an interesting one. So when you have a div where you've specified that this div needs to be exactly this size, so width, height, everything, and then you have a lot of text inside that div. Text overflow is what you would use to specify what happens when this text runs out of the div. So you can use a clip, which is going to just cut that text off when it runs out of space, or you can use ellipses, which will add the 3 little dots at the end saying that there's more text here, but I'm not showing it. That's quite a useful one. And then one of the pretty ones is text shadow. So you can add shadows to your text. So you specify your text shadow. By firstly specifying where it should appear. So you give it 2 numbers. The first number is how far horizontally it should appear, and the second number is vertically. If you specify a negative, it will go up and to the left. If you specify positive, it will go down and to the right. And then, so if we have 10 pixels, red. And then the third is a color. Again, with all of these, you don't have to use the color. It's just easier for me to type 3 letters red. You can see it there. Yeah, it looks quite. So then if we put this as negatives, it will go to the other side. Then there's one more thing you can put on here, which is to make that shadow a little bit blurry, because that makes it look quite ugly. So we can add over here that. Anyway, so this is another reason I don't really like CSS, because I'm really bad at figuring out where things should go on a web page. But that's just me. Doesn't have to be you. All right. Then we have text transforms. Text transforms are also quite useful, so you can capitalize your first letter, for example. So if we or make it all uppercase, text transform, uppercase, like that. You can also go capitalize, which will capitalize the first letter of every word in your sentence. And you can, what are the other ones? None, which is the default one. And you can also do lowercase as well, which will put everything into lowercase. And then the last one in terms of text is word break. So sometimes when you have a very long URL, for example, and it can't fit onto the page in one thing, then you want to break it, because otherwise it will just display and go off screen and you'd have to scroll sideways. And that's what word break does. So word break means when you run out of space, break the words however I tell you to. So by default it's normal, which means that it won't try to break anything. So if it's a really long word, it will still put it and you'd have to scroll horizontally. But then you can use break all, which will mean that even if there's no spaces anywhere in this page, I'm going to break as soon as I get to the end of this block that I'm in and display the rest on the next row, where it will break the word. It will try to break the word properly if it's proper words with like a dash, but if it's a URL, it will just break it wherever. Okay, then one of the very important parts of CSS is something called the box model. It's pretty much how things get displayed on your page. So we have, most of the things are block elements, right? They're blocks of text, or image block. And the box model defines what parts of the page it takes up. So let's start with our image that we had earlier and apply things to that. So I'm going to get rid of this stuff and put the BBD image back on here. So when we refresh this, our image was really big. So we can't really see it, right? So the first thing of the box model is the height and the width of something. So if we start styling our image tag, we could have a height of 400 pixels. And there we go. So again, we're only specifying the height, so the image shrinks its width to still be in the same proportions. If we specify the width as well, it would look weird. And this is what someone else was asking earlier about percentages. So now, instead of using pixels, we could use percentages. Let's say width 50%. This means that it will take up 50% of the web page. So if you were on your phone looking at this web page, the logo would shrink to 50% of your phone. If you are on a tablet, so that's why it's usually good for images especially to use percentages rather than pixels, so it makes them more responsive. So that's the first part of the box model. And if we look at this now, let's just go back to the pixels so we can see it changing. If I hover over this now, you can see it's quite small over there, but it says that this image is 400 pixels. And one other thing that's quite useful with the DevTools in Chrome is this over here. It's that same box model. So it's telling us where my box is. where this thing that I'm looking at is. So you can see that none of the other things are defined. We just have the image over there. All right, so let's add some more stuff. So height and width are the first two things of the box model. And then we get padding. Padding means add some space in between from whatever container I'm in, put some space inside it so that I'm not right against the container. So it's adding it to the inside of my container. So padding, you can go top, so you can say top or bottom or left and right. Or you can say padding. And then this one, you go in order. So you start at the top and you go clockwise. So the first padding you specify is the top, then it's right, then bottom, then left. Right. So that would specify all four of them. What you can also do is combine them. But when you start combining them, it kind of gets confusing and you forget which one applies to what. But you can do just two of them. Just two of them means the 10 pixels here would be top and bottom, and the 5 would be left and right. While you can also do 3. And what that means is the 5 will still be left and right, the 10 will be top, and the 7 will be bottom. Okay.
Exactly. 10 on top.
Yes. Yeah. So you always start on top. But yeah, it's easier to just specify all four or to do them by name. So padding dash top, padding dash left, if you only want to specify one. So now we've added our padding, and if you look at it, okay, let's make our padding a bit bigger. You can see it moved away from the sides, because that's what padding does. It moves it away from its container. Okay, and if we hover over the padding over there, it displays it like this. It shows you where your padding is. Just shrink that there. So you can see our 100 pixels at the top, our 50 pixels on the sides, and the 70 at the bottom. Now, padding, oh, not there. Padding is part of the image. So now if you have a look over there, it says that our image is actually bigger. So padding gets contained in the image, in the thing we're displaying. It's part of it. Then the next thing is border. So we can add borders to things. And with the border, you can also specify, so you can say border dash color and specify the color of the border. So by default, if you specify a border, it will be black if you don't specify its color. You can say border dash width and border dash style. Those are the three. But with this one, it's also quite easy to use the shorthand. So it's border, then you specify how wide with pixels or EMs or whatever, how wide the border should be. So 10 pixels. Then you specify the style of your border, which can be solid, it can be dashed, it can be dotted. There's a few different styles of borders. And then the last thing you specify is the color of your border. Now, if we refresh here, we have a border over there. If we don't specify the color, it will still be a black border. So black is the default color for a border. And again, you can see it over here and it shows it to you. And same as with padding, you can specify borders only on a certain side. So you can say that it should be only a border on the top or only a border on the bottom or left or right. Same as with padding. And same as with padding, the border gets counted as part of the size of the image. So now our image has increased in size again because we have a border. And then the last part of the box model is the margin. The margin is the only one that doesn't count towards the size of your image. And the margin is what moves the image outside of its containing box. So we saw that the padding moved it away from the border, while the margin will move it together with its border away from something. And the margin, same as the padding, gets applied in the same order: top, right, bottom, left. And you can also do margin dash left, margin dash right, and so on. Let's do. Oh, and another thing that you can do both with margin and padding is just specify one number. So if you say margin 10, means put margin of 10 everywhere. So now if we refresh, you would see it moved completely together with its border away from the sides. And there's the margin on the outside. And the margin is not part of the size of the image. Oh, and you can also specify maximum height and width on your images and a minimum height and width on your images. That means that when you specify a percentage, for example, on an image, so say it must be 50% width, but minimum width must be 50 pixels. That means no matter how small that screen gets, it won't ever go below 50 pixels. Box shadow, same as with text shadow, you can apply a shadow to a whole box. And it works exactly the same way, and it does the same thing where it puts the little shadow like without text. And then overflow. Let's copy this from here and then copy the overflow stuff. So overflow is for, again, when you have a box with too much text inside it. And this tells it what to do with that extra text. So in our first one, we have auto, which means it automatically adds a scroll bar. Even though we've limited the size of the div that it's contained in, it creates a scroll bar for us so that we can see the text. Then we have clipped, which means that it's cut off any overflow, and visible, which means that display it anyway, it doesn't matter that it's outside of the box. I don't know why you would use this one, but it's there. Right. Then the types of CSS boxes. So I spoke a little bit about the span earlier, how a span is displayed inline and a paragraph is displayed as a block, right? So anything within a span, wherever you add it, will get displayed inline. So if we add a span here, you will see it doesn't add any extra lines. However, if this was a paragraph, it would create a new line and put it on a new line, because a paragraph is a block tag, takes up the entire width of the page. And you can control that with CSS as well, with the display display. Display. So display has a few settings. It can be display block, which is what by default a paragraph does. Display inline, which means it's what a span does, so display it next to each other. Or you can do display inline block. I think there's actually an example here. Let's copy this quickly. So you can see the difference between them. So over here at the top, this is display inline. So it just puts everything next to each other. This one here is this display block, so it skips a line between each of them. And the last one is display inline block. Now, you can't really see it here because my screen is too big, so let me just do this quickly. So you can see the difference between the inline and inline block. So you see the inline, no matter what, displays next to each other. While the inline block, if it runs out of space, moves on to the next line. One other cool thing about DevTools while we're here is it has this device toolbar over here. And when you hit that, it can display it as if it was inside a phone. Yeah, and you can specify which phone you want to use. So you can see how your website would display in different phones. So you have a Pixel, you have an iPhone. The iPhone even has a little border around it, which is kind of cool. Galaxy S5. Yeah. Alright, that's displaying. Then positioning. Okay, so we have all of these blocks on the page, and by default all of these blocks get displayed in the place where you put them. So when you put a bunch of paragraphs and one underneath the other, they will get displayed one underneath the other. So let's just copy this in here so we can tell all of our things apart. Okay. Then we're going to add to our second paragraph over here. We're going to add a class. Add that to the bottom of our styles. Okay, so we have a class, and by default the position is, what's happening? Oops. I replaced everything. The entire HTML document. Alright, let's try that again without breaking stuff. The next person to notice when I make a mistake gets a t-shirt. No? Not how it works? Okay, fine. Right, just putting this back, I deleted my entire HTML document. That's why it didn't work. Okay. So we have that yellow tag over there, the yellow paragraph. Okay. Now, the only different style we've specified on our yellow paragraph is that its position must be static. But by default, everything on a page is static. Okay, so it hasn't changed anything at all. The other positions we can use, let's start with relative. So relative, if we change that and refresh, it still looks the same. Wow, amazing. Why does it still look the same? Can someone tell me why it still looks the same? What is it relative to? Its parent element, yes. So it's relative to its parent element, and its parent element hasn't moved. So you're almost there. Almost there. Good job. All right. So it's relative to the element it's contained in. It hasn't moved, like you said, so that's why it stayed in the same place. But we can make it move, and that's where a few of the other properties come in. We have a property top, bottom, left, right. So let's just do top and left. Before I show you what happens, who wants to take a guess what will happen? Well, let's do it this way. All right. Who says it will move down and across? Show of hands. Okay? Who says it will move that way and up? Okay, let's see who's right. Okay, so what we're saying is this paragraph here is contained within its box. It's relative to where it is. And what we mean when we say top is go on the top and push it 30 pixels down. And when we say bottom, it would mean push it 30 pixels up. So it can be a little bit confusing because you're saying top, but it's moving down. But yeah. Okay. Now, important thing with top left, if we change this back to static. Top left, bottom right don't apply to statically positioned elements. Okay. Then the next one we need to have a look at is absolute. Guess on what will happen now. There's one important part that you missed there. All right, so it's right, it won't move. If we move up and down, if we change the screen, it won't move. But what happened to it? Went to the top. Because now it's no longer relative to the element it's contained in, it's now relative to the entire page. So absolute means I don't care about anything around me. It's just me. Selfish setting, yes. Okay. That's absolute, and again, with absolute, you can also use the top, bottom, left, and right to move the elements, and you almost actually resizing them, because we haven't specified a right and bottom here. It's pulled it all the way to the right because it will stretch it until the end, until where you specify right. Okay. So this is the part where we were saying what element is the containing element or the parent element of that absolutely positioned element. And it's the entire HTML. It's not even the body, it's the HTML tag that contains an absolutely positioned element. While the relative one is the one we used earlier for the element inside relative to what element it's contained in. So let's add this piece of code here. Now we've positioned another element with absolute, this green one over here, but it's not visible. And this is where we get the Z index. So on a web page, we have X and Y, where the top corner over here is 0x, 0y. Okay? And X goes that way, Y goes this way. And now we get Z. The Z, the third dimension, right? Z goes this way. So from the web page out towards you, right? And when we have an element like this where we can't see it because something is on top of it, with HTML, the element that got added last is the one that gets displayed on top. We can set the Z index to say that this element should actually be on top of another one. And the Z index you set by just setting a number. So if we set the Z index to 1 of this green one that we created over here, you can see it moves to the top. Now, this number doesn't have a specific scale, so people usually try to use 0, 1. So if this was 1 or 100, it won't display any differently, right? It's just based on what the Z index of the other elements on the page are. So if you want to use 100, 200, 300, you're welcome to. But 1, 2, 3 is usually enough and less typing. And then we also have fixed positioning. Now, fixed positioning is, I think, what you may have been thinking of, where fixed positioning, when you apply a fixed position to something, it means it won't move. So over here, we're applying a fixed position to the header, to the H1. So position fixed, and our top has been set to 0. What that will do is just take out this over here so it's not in our way, and make this relative again. So you see what happened now? Our header is being displayed on top, and as we move, it moves with us. That's fixed. Okay, we're going quite a bit over time. So I'm going to try go a little bit quicker over here and show you this float very quickly. So as I was saying earlier, back in the day, we used to use tables to make things, put them into column layouts. But that wasn't very responsive, and when we got mobile phones, we couldn't actually show any of those things on our mobile phones. And then a CSS property called float was created. Oops. So paragraph. Put this in here. Float means take this element and make it float somewhere. Where will it float? Either on the left or on the right. So before we show this, let's have a look what this looks like. So now we have this image here with a whole bunch of text underneath it. Because it's block elements, the text can't go next to the image. But that's where float is going to help us. So if we make the image float on the left, we now have our text displayed next to our image. So our image is still a block element and it has its size and everything, but it's kind of floating, so it allows things to appear next to it if there's room. Which also means that if there isn't room, so if we are on a smaller device, it still gets displayed correctly. So you can float things to the left, you can float things to the right. And an important thing to remember is that you always need to clear your floats. So if you have a float left and float right, that's great. They'll display nicely. But then if you put something else underneath that, it will suddenly appear like halfway up your page. And that becomes kind of weird. But that's because it doesn't know, because those elements are floating, it thinks there's space there. So what you do to clear a float is you say clear, but you wouldn't do it on that same image. You would have to do it on whatever element comes underneath that floating image. So if on our P over here we said clear, and the values for clear are clear left, so you only clear the floating left elements, clear right to clear the right ones, or clear both. Usually safer to just use both. So they cleared the float and now put the text underneath again. Floats can also be used to easily put things into columns. So if we take this example here quickly, so to put something into a column, into two columns, you would firstly specify that you want each of the divs, so the first div and the second div, to take up 48% of the width, and the one to float to the left and the other to float to the right. The reason we wanted to take up 48% and not 100% or 50% is so that there's a little gap in between them, so that the letters aren't like right next to each other. So if we refresh that, we have a nice two-column layout. No longer need to use tables. Then floats help a lot with responsive design. So how often have you been on a website on your phone and you can't actually see anything and you have to zoom in a lot and scroll sideways and up and down? That's because they didn't design their website for mobile. And responsive web design is about designing things so that it changes depending on how your screen size changes. So if you had a phone, you would have something that displayed like this, while on a tablet it would be like that, and on an actual desktop it would be something like this. There's many advantages for responsive design, so it saves a lot of time and money because you don't need to implement different websites. So before this responsive design was a thing, we used to create separate websites for different layouts, which is quite a mission. You need to have a lot of people working on these things and implementing 3 different sets of websites. So that's why one of the biggest advantages of responsive design. So it's also better for sharing stats for your company's website. So when you share your mobile site, it might be, if it's the different URL to your normal website, you don't get the same stats. There are some negatives. So because you have to alter the content using the client side, so you have to do it in HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. You usually end up writing quite a lot of CSS or quite a lot of JavaScript to cater for the responsiveness of a website. So that's kind of a negative. And If you already have a website, making it responsive is really difficult. And since you're adding a lot of code to your scripts and to your styles, it can make the size of your website a bit bigger, which would mean that people accessing it would have worse performance. In order to make your website responsive, we use things called media queries. And media queries get applied whether it be on screen or print. So those are the two things you can apply it to. So you can make your website change based on whether people are trying to print it, which is quite useful. And you target certain media features. So for example, you would say when screen max width reaches 400 pixels, change the following styles. That's how you use media queries. Okay. Oh, and then there's one more section in here on backgrounds. We already covered borders, but backgrounds. So how to set the background of something. So background properties. Background, you can have a background attachment. I've never used that before. Background color, which you specify the colors the same way as we did all the text colors. You can have a background image where you can provide a relative or absolute URL to the image you want to use as a background. Background attachment is a little bit different. So background attachment is more about where the image is going to get positioned. Yeah, so you can see the two settings for background attachment are scroll and fixed. So scroll meaning that the background should move with, it will scroll the image or whatever it is. A fixed will be like the fixed element where the background will move as you scroll down. Yeah, something like that. Background image, background position. So background position, usually the background, if you're using an image, will get displayed from that 0 point at the top of X, but you can move it a little bit. So you might want to like make it off center or something and put it in a specific place. We can have a background repeat. That is very tiring for the eyes. If you have a little image and you make it repeat everywhere on your background, that hurts the eyes. The size of the background, so you can set a specific size for your background if you're using an image so that you can limit it. Borders we talked about. One thing we didn't talk about for borders was the border radius. Border radiuses are pretty cool. I really like them. I know they're not in fashion anymore, but I still like them. So border radius, a little bit of background on border radiuses. Okay, so when rounded corners first became a thing for the web, so making buttons with rounded corners and things like that, there was no way to do it using CSS. So what we had to do is create images and put them as the background of the button. And that would be your rounded corner button. So that's why when border radiuses came about, everyone used them. And that's what a border radius does. So we have this H1 here. It's a very much late 90s, early 2000s web styles. So I've been told not to use it anymore. Okay, so if we have a border, let's refresh that. So there we have our border. Let's make it a bit thicker so we can actually see it. And the way you specify your border radius is you can specify what each corner's radius should be. So you could go border dash radius dash top dash left radius should be 10 pixels. Now if we refresh that, you can see my top left corner is a little bit curved. Okay, you can also specify it for the entire thing. So if you exclude that there, or put it on all 4 corners. And again, with the pixels, you can use EMs, and you can also use percentages. And if you set it to 50%, it makes it an oval. Some faces. I'm good at this. Okay, so yeah, that's border radiuses. Apparently, it's not a 2018 thing, so you shouldn't do it anymore. But I like them, so that's why they don't let me pick the colors for this. Cool. All right. So that's CSS.